The air tasted like burning copper and regret. Elas Crane sat in the maintenance bay of Forward Station Echo, watching emergency lighting cast everything in shades of angry red, and contemplated the series of catastrophically poor life choices that had delivered him to this exact moment. The console in front of him displayed a message that would have been hilarious if it weren't so thoroughly damning. Critical alert. All personnel, evacuate immediately. Enemy contact in Sector 79. This is not a drill. The problem, of course, was that all personnel had evacuated approximately 4 hours ago without him. In my defense, Elas said aloud to no one in particular, talking to himself had become a cherished hobby during his 14 months on this forsaken rock. I did tell Davidson that the coolant recycler in Junction C was making that noise again. I specifically said it sounded like a dying cat. Davidson had said it could wait until after the supply run. The dying cat noise had transformed into a full mechanical death rattle around 0600 hours, right when the evacuation sirens started wailing. By the time Elas had crawled out of the access tunnel, covered in fluorescent blue coolant, and questioning his entire career trajectory, the last transport had already vanished into Turius 9's perpetually overcast sky. He'd stood there on a landing pad, dripping industrial fluid, watching the thruster glow fade into the clouds, and experienced what he could only describe as a profound moment of cosmic abandonment. That was 4 hours ago. Now crouched in the maintenance bay, with half the station's systems dying around him, Elas was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. He was about to have a very bad day. The tactical display showed them coming. Dozens of contacts moving in precise formation across the ridge that overlooked the station. Elas wasn't military, not in any meaningful sense. He was a combat engineer in the loosest possible interpretation of the title, which meant he kept the automated defenses running, and occasionally welded things that absolutely shouldn't be welded together. His military training consisted of a 2-week crash course that had focused primarily on not shooting himself in the foot and filling out incident reports correctly. "Okay," he muttered, pulling up the station's defensive systems. "Okay, think. What would a competent person do?" The automated turrets were offline. He'd been in the middle of updating their targeting software when the evacuation order came through. The blast doors were functional, but wouldn't stop anything more determined than a stiff breeze. The garrison that was supposed to be stationed here had been pulled out 3 weeks ago for redeployment, military speak for we're losing everywhere, and need bodies somewhere more important than this dump. Elas pulled up a schematic of the station. Forward Station Echo had been built as an early warning outpost and supply depot, which meant it was approximately 30% living quarters, 50% storage, and 20% maintenance tunnels that nobody had properly mapped. He'd spent the better part of a year crawling through those tunnels, fixing coolant leaks and rerouting power conduits, and he knew them better than anyone had a right to. As he stared at the blueprints, an idea began forming. Terrible, dangerous, the kind that would get him court-martialed if he survived long enough to face a tribunal. Then again, surviving seemed increasingly optional. Right then, Elas said, standing up and immediately regretting it as his back popped in 3 distinct places. "Let's see what we can weaponize." He spent the next 20 minutes in a frantic scavenger hunt through the station's storage base. Mining charges meant for excavation work, yes. Industrial plasma cutters designed for salvage operations, absolutely. The experimental high-output capacitors that had been flagged as potentially hazardous and definitely not approved for field use, already tucked under his arm. By the time he was done, he looked like the world's most desperate hardware store robbery suspect, loaded with improvised destructive potential. The contacts were closer now. Through the external cameras, Elas could see them, figures in dark armor moving with coordinated precision that suggested significant military training. They were thorough, checking every approach vector, covering each other with practiced ease. Professional. That was worse than if they'd been sloppy. Sloppy would have given him more options. He rigged his first surprise in the main corridor, a mining charge wired to a motion sensor salvaged from the automatic doors. Crude, but crude had the advantage of being unpredictable. The second surprise involved rerouting coolant through the ventilation system in the east wing. Would it work? Probably not. Would it be confusing and potentially fatal if he got the mixture right? He was genuinely curious to find out. By the time he'd finished, the station looked less like a defensive position and more like a mechanical nervous breakdown expressed through improvised explosives. Elas crouched behind a support pillar in what used to be the command center, clutching a plasma cutter he'd modified to run at approximately twice its recommended power output. The barrel was already starting to heat up in a way that the safety manual would have described as inadvisable, and Ellis would describe as probably going to blow my hand off. But let's stay positive. The exterior door cycled open with a hiss of equalizing pressure. His heart hammered against his ribs as the first figure entered, tall, humanoid, moving with liquid grace. The armor was unlike anything he'd seen in intelligence briefings, dark and seamless, almost organic in its appearance. 3 more followed, then 6. They spread out through the command center with textbook precision, weapons raised, checking corners and sight lines. Ellis held his breath, watching through a cracked monitor that gave him a view of the corridor. They were speaking to each other in a language that sounded like wind chimes played backwards, their voices carrying an odd melodic quality even through their helmet speakers. One of them moved toward the corridor where he'd rigged his first surprise. Ellis's finger hovered over the detonator, a modified fire alarm button he'd rewired because he'd always hated that particular alarm, and this seemed like an appropriately spiteful use for it. The soldier took another step, then another. Ellis pressed the button. The explosion tore through the corridor with gratifying violence, and the station's emergency systems immediately began shrieking about hull breaches and pressure loss. In the chaos, Ellis popped up from behind his pillar and fired the plasma cutter. The beam caught one of the soldiers across the chest plate, and while it didn't penetrate, the figure stumbled backward, clearly surprised. "Sorry," Ellis shouted, because even in combat situations, his mother had raised him to be polite. "Nothing personal." "Well, actually very personal. You're invading." He ducked back as return fire scorched the air where his head had been, then triggered his second surprise. Coolant vapor flooded the east wing, and he heard confused shouting in that wind chime language. One of the soldiers stumbled into view, their armor systems apparently not designed for an environment that was simultaneously freezing and caustic. Ellis ran. The maintenance tunnels smelled like oil and desperation, which seemed appropriate given his current circumstances. He'd been playing the galaxy's worst game of hide-and-seek for nearly an hour, and his opponents were proving significantly better at it than he'd hoped. The plasma cutter had died 20 minutes ago, its power cell exhausted from what the manufacturer would probably call aggressive misuse, leaving him armed with a length of pipe and what he privately referred to as strategic pessimism. Above him, through the tunnel ceiling panels, he could hear them moving. The aliens had adapted to his traps with concerning speed, now advancing in smaller groups, checking for tripwires before committing to any corridor. They'd started calling out to each other in patterns. 2 short chirps followed by a longer trill apparently meant area clear. A descending whistle sequence translated to something like "this human is significantly more annoying than our briefing suggested." Ellis had learned their signals through pure necessity, and was now attempting to use them against his pursuers, which would have been clever if he weren't absolutely butchering the pronunciation. His attempt at area clear sounded more like a rusty hinge having an emotional breakdown. Still, it had caused a satisfying amount of confusion approximately 3 times, which he considered a personal victory. He reached Junction 7, a hub where 4 maintenance tunnels intersected around the station's primary power conduit. The conduit hummed with barely contained energy, a thick column of bundle cables and cooling tubes that fed electricity to every system in the facility. Ellis had spent weeks working on this section, cursing its poor design and even worse documentation. Now staring at it with the eyes of someone who'd abandoned all pretense of following safety regulations, he saw a possibility. "This is monumentally stupid," he informed the conduit. "Just so we're clear, I know this is stupid." The conduit, being an inanimate object, offered no opinion. Ellis took this as tacit approval. He pulled himself up onto the maintenance platform and started disconnecting coolant lines. The power conduit's temperature immediately began rising, which was exactly the point. Within 5 minutes, the junction would be hot enough to trigger the automatic emergency venting system. Within 10, it would be hot enough that anyone standing near it without proper protective gear would deeply regret their life choices. Within 15, it might actually explode, but Ellis was trying very hard not to think about that particular timeline. He scrambled back into the tunnel, just as he heard movement approaching from the western passage. 2 soldiers moving in synchronized steps, their armor servo motors making a distinctive whirring sound that Ellis had learned to recognize. He pressed himself against the tunnel wall, barely breathing, watching through a gap in the access panel as they entered the junction. They stopped. One of them, slightly taller than the other with what might have been rank insignia etched into the armor, tilted their head toward the power conduit. Even through the helmet, Ellis could sense confusion. The soldier said something in that melodic language, and the other responded with what sounded distinctly like concern. The temperature gauge on the conduit was climbing into the red zone. Ellis had maybe 30 seconds before the venting system activated. He needed them to leave, but they were standing there apparently discussing whether the overheating conduit was worth investigating or whether they should call for technical support, which struck Ellis as hilariously ironic given that he was the technical support. 20 seconds. The conduit was beginning to make an ominous creaking sound. The shorter soldier took a step closer, reaching toward a diagnostic panel. "Oh, don't do that," Ellis whispered. "Really don't do that." The soldier did that. Their gloved hand touched the panel, and apparently their armor's sensors immediately communicated just how catastrophically hot everything had become because they jerked backward with a yelp that needed no translation. 10 seconds. Both soldiers were backing away now, the taller one speaking rapidly into what was probably a communications device. Ellis could see the venting system's warning lights beginning to flash. He stuffed his fingers in his ears and opened his mouth to equalize pressure, a trick he'd learned from a demolitions expert during his abbreviated training. The venting system activated with a roar that sounded like a dragon with bronchitis, releasing superheated air in a directional blast that had been carefully engineered to vent away from the station's habitable sections. Unfortunately for the two soldiers, the habitable sections did not include the exact spot where they were standing. The blast caught them full force, throwing them backward through the junction. Their armor probably saved their lives, but Ellis could see smoke rising from the surface as they tumbled into the eastern corridor. He didn't wait to see if they'd recover, instead scrambling through the tunnel system toward his next prepared position. The problem with fighting a guerrilla war in a space station was that eventually you ran out of space station. Ellis had been mentally mapping his retreat route, and he was running low on both territory and tricks. He'd used most of his mining charges. The coolant system was effectively useless now, and his improvised traps were getting increasingly desperate. His last setup involved a cargo loader, 300 pounds of frozen ration packs, and what he could only describe as optimistic physics. He reached the cargo bay, breathing hard, his ribs aching from where he'd bounced off a too-narrow tunnel opening. The aliens had to know he was running out of room to maneuver. They'd be tightening the perimeter, cutting off escape routes, preparing for a final push. Standard tactics, textbook boring. Ellis climbed into the cargo loader's operator cage, a cramped seat designed for moving supply pallets around the bay. The loader itself was a hulking piece of equipment, all hydraulic arms and magnetic clamps strong enough to shift a loaded transport container. He'd spent the last of his access privileges overriding its safety limiters, which had involved convincing the onboard computer that he was performing an emergency maintenance procedure. The computer had questioned this explanation approximately 15 times before giving up, which demonstrated a disappointing lack of backbone in artificial intelligence. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside the cargo bay. Multiple contacts moving with purpose. They'd found him. Ellis powered up the cargo loader, feeling it rumble to life beneath him. The bay's main door cycled open, and soldiers poured through. 6, 7, 8 of them. Weapons raised and tracking. He saw one of them raise a hand, apparently signaling the others to hold fire, and he heard something in that chiming language that might have been a demand for surrender. "Hi there," Ellis called out, waving from the operator cage with his free hand while the other gripped the loader's control stick. "Quick question. How much does your armor weigh?" "Roughly, just ballpark it for me." They didn't shoot immediately, which suggested either confusion or discipline, possibly both. One of them raised a hand, apparently signaling the others to hold fire. "Sorry, I don't speak musical wind," Ellis replied, then yanked the control stick hard to the right. The cargo loader's arm swung around with 300 pounds of frozen rations clamped in its magnetic grip, moving at a speed that would have horrified the safety inspector and absolutely delighted the chaos gods. The makeshift projectile caught 3 soldiers mid-formation, scattering them like bowling pins designed by a committee that had never actually seen bowling. Ellis didn't wait for them to recover, instead slamming the loader into forward motion, its massive treads chewing up the deck plating as he charged directly at the remaining soldiers. To their credit, they scattered with admirable speed. To his credit, Ellis managed to clip one with the loader's extended arm, while simultaneously shouting something that might have been a battle cry, or might have been a plea to whatever deity protected idiots in stolen heavy equipment. Later analysis would prove inconclusive. While Ellis fought his desperate last stand on the surface of Turius 9, Empress Kalira stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Sovereign Dawn, watching forward station Echo pulse as an orange marker against the gray-green sprawl of the planet below. Tactical data streamed past in luminescent text, and she found herself unable to understand why a single human was causing her military precisely this much trouble. Empress, her tactical officer reported, his long ears swept back from his temples in the elegant manner of all Ashvern nobility, twitching with what might have been embarrassment. Commander Vok is requesting permission to level the entire facility. He suggests that further attempts at conventional assault may result in casualties that are, and I quote, statistically inappropriate for the capture of one unarmed technician. Kalira turned from a display to regard Officer Tesh, who had the decency to look uncomfortable delivering such a message. Around them, the command bridge of the Sovereign Dawn hummed with quiet efficiency, dozens of crew members monitoring systems and coordinating the broader invasion that was proceeding with far more success on every other front. Tertius 9 was falling. Humanity's outer colonies were collapsing like dominoes. This should have been simple. Unarmed, Kalira repeated, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone testing whether reality was playing an elaborate joke. Our intelligence confirmed the station garrison evacuated. One engineer remained behind. One. He has no military training, no combat experience, and no support. She gestured at the display, where casualty reports were accumulating with uncomfortable speed. And yet Commander Vok is requesting orbital bombardment. The human appears to be utilizing the station's infrastructure as an improvised weapon system, my Empress, Tesh said carefully. His tactics are highly unconventional. Our soldiers are trained to respond to recognized combat patterns. This individual does not appear to be following any pattern we can identify. Show me, Kalira commanded. The holographic display shifted, pulling up recorded footage from the helmet cameras of her ground forces. She watched in silence as a human, small by Ashvern standards, wearing maintenance coveralls covered in stains, detonated a corridor behind a squad of her best soldiers. The explosive yield was crude but effective. Then the human appeared from cover wielding an industrial tool modified into a weapon and actually apologized before shooting. He said sorry while attacking, Kalira noted. The human was remarkable in its contradictions. Our linguists believe it may be a cultural oddity, my Empress, Tesh explained. Humans appear to have complex social rituals around violence. The next clip showed the same human flooding a section with caustic vapor, then fleeing through maintenance tunnels that her soldiers were too large to easily navigate. The footage that followed depicted increasingly creative uses of station equipment. A cargo loader used as a battering ram. Power conduits weaponized through deliberate overheating. And at one point, what appeared to be frozen food supplies deployed as projectiles. He's not fighting us, Kalira said slowly, understanding dawning. He's making the station fight us. He's turned the entire facility into an extension of himself. An inefficient extension, my Empress, Tesh observed. His methods are desperate and resource-intensive, but effective. Kalira dismissed the footage and pulled up the tactical overview again. How many soldiers has Commander Vok committed to this facility? 43, my Empress. With 16 casualties, mostly injuries from environmental hazards rather than direct combat. No fatalities, though 3 will require extended medical treatment for chemical exposure and thermal damage. 43 trained soldiers against 1 human who had been, according to the intelligence profile she'd reviewed, installing coolant systems and filing maintenance reports for the past 14 months. Kalira felt something unfamiliar stirring in her thoughts. Not quite respect, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Curiosity, perhaps, or the dawning realization that humanity might be more interesting than her strategic advisors had calculated. The door to the command bridge opened with a whisper of pressurized air, and Kalira's sister Saras entered, still wearing her combat armor from whatever operation she'd been overseeing planetside. Saras was younger by 3 years, with ears that swept back at a more aggressive angle, and an expression that suggested she'd just experienced something worth sharing. Sister, Saras said, offering the abbreviated bow that protocol demanded. I hear our forces are being stymied by a particularly determined custodian. Engineer, Kalira corrected, and he's doing more than stymieing us. He's teaching us something uncomfortable about our assumptions. Saras moved to stand beside her, studying the tactical display with the eye of someone who'd spent considerable time in actual combat rather than observing it from orbit. Her armor bore scorch marks from recent fighting, and there was a small dent in her shoulder plate that would need repair. We assumed humans would either flee or surrender when confronted with overwhelming force, Saras said. We've been assuming that across every engagement, and they've been doing exactly that in 90% of our encounters. She tapped the display where forward station echo pulsed. This one didn't get the message. Or he did, and chose to ignore it, which is potentially more interesting. Saras pulled up additional data streams comparing engagement reports across the entire invasion front. I've been reviewing the pattern of human resistance. Most of their forces are withdrawing to defensive positions, trying to consolidate and prepare for protracted siege scenarios. Standard doctrine for a technologically inferior force. But there have been anomalies, small units that fought beyond tactical reason. Individuals who held positions they should have abandoned. Refusals to surrender, even when offered honorable terms. Kalira listened, watching the data cascade past. She'd authorized this invasion with significant reservations, not because she felt any particular sympathy for humanity, but because the strategic value seemed questionable relative to the resource expenditure. The Ashvaran Dominion had expanded across this sector of space for 3 generations, encountering dozens of species. Most had been incorporated peacefully through demonstration of superior technology and culture. A few had required military pressure. None had been particularly memorable. Humans had seemed destined for the latter category, fractious, technologically adolescent, prone to internal conflict. Early reconnaissance had suggested they'd fragment under pressure. Individual colonies and nation-states prioritizing their own survival over collective resistance. The invasion had been projected to take 4 months with minimal casualties. They were 3 weeks in, and while the overall strategic picture favored the Dominion overwhelmingly, these anomalies kept appearing. One engineer in a maintenance facility, armed with nothing but desperation and institutional knowledge, was holding off a strike team. It shouldn't matter, Kalira said aloud. It's tactically irrelevant. But she found herself unable to dismiss it. What do we know about this human, she asked. Tesh pulled up a personnel file. By his service record, Elas Crane, age 32 by their calendar. Trained as a combat engineer, but served primarily in maintenance and logistics roles. No combat decorations. Psychological profile suggests high intelligence, tendency towards sarcasm when stressed, and what their evaluators called creative problem-solving skills that occasionally violate established protocols. He's currently demonstrating those skills quite enthusiastically, Saras observed. Kalira made a decision, the kind that came from instincts shaped by years of command and a lifetime of studying what made civilization survive or collapse. She turned to Tesh, who straightened to attention before she'd even spoken. Recall Commander Vox's forces. Pull them back to a perimeter position around the facility, but cease all offensive operations. My Empress. Tesh's composure cracked for the first time. I'm going down there, Kalira said simply. Prepare my shuttle and an honor guard. I'm invoking the right of personal engagement. The command bridge fell silent. Saras's ears tilted forward in shock, and even Tesh's professional composure fully fractured. The right of personal engagement was an ancient Ashvaran tradition, rarely used and never in living memory by an empress. It allowed the highest-ranking officer to personally confront an enemy combatant who demonstrated exceptional courage or skill, offering them a chance to negotiate directly rather than through military channels. He's earned it, Kalira said simply. Elas became aware of consciousness returning the way one becomes aware of a dental appointment, gradually, reluctantly, and with the firm conviction that unconsciousness had been significantly preferable. Everything hurt in ways that seemed anatomically creative. His left arm was definitely not supposed to bend at that angle. His ribs were auditioning for a percussion ensemble, and something warm was trickling down the side of his face that was probably blood, but might have been more coolant because at this point, his body was approximately 40% industrial fluids. He was sitting, he realized, against something solid. The cargo loader had finally died somewhere in the 3rd or 4th engagement. He'd lost count, and his final gambit had involved the station's fusion core and electromagnetic pulse, and what he could only describe as aggressive optimism regarding equipment tolerances. The pulse had worked, frying every piece of sophisticated electronics in a 300-meter radius. Unfortunately, this had included the life support systems, the lights, and his own improvised weapons. Also, unfortunately, he'd been somewhat closer to the pulse than strictly advisable. Light filtered through the smoke and dust, emergency lighting, probably running on backup batteries. Elas tried to move and discovered that his body had filed a formal complaint with his nervous system and was currently refusing to cooperate. He settled for opening his eyes fully and attempting to assess his situation, which was when he noticed he was surrounded. They stood in a perfect circle around him, maybe 20 soldiers, their armor scorched and damaged, but still operational. No weapons pointed at him, which seemed promising, but also no clear avenue of escape, which seemed less so. They were just standing there watching him with what he interpreted as professional confusion. "So," Ellis said, his voice coming out as a croak that had aspirations of being words, "I don't suppose any of you fine folks speak English and want to discuss surrender terms? I'm open to negotiation. I've got nothing left to blow up, which should make this easier for everyone." None of them responded, but he noticed several helmets tilting in what might have been consultation. Then the circle parted and someone new walked through. She was tall, taller than him by several inches, though admittedly he was currently slumped against wreckage like a very unsuccessful scarecrow. The armor she wore was different from the soldiers, more ornate, with patterns etched into the surface that caught the emergency lighting. But it was her face that made Ellis's exhausted brain stumble over itself trying to process information. She looked human, remarkably, disconcertingly human, with sharp features and dark eyes that studied him with uncomfortable intensity. Except for her ears, which swept back from her temples in elegant points that extended well beyond anything human anatomy would produce, giving her an appearance that Ellis's oxygen-deprived brain unhelpfully categorized as extremely intimidating elven royalty. She said something in that musical language, her voice carrying an authority that needed no translation. One of the soldiers responded, and she replied with what sounded like a dismissal. The soldiers retreated to a wider perimeter, leaving Ellis alone with someone who was clearly very important and very interested in him specifically. "You are Elas Crane," she said in perfect English, her accent adding a melodic quality to the words that made them sound almost like a song. "That's me," Ellis confirmed, because lying seemed pointless when he could barely remember how sitting worked. "And you are someone who definitely outranks everyone else here. I'm guessing. Did I blow up someone important? Is that why we're having this conversation? Because I'd like to formally apologize while also pointing out that you did invade my workplace. So there's some shared responsibility here." Something flickered across her face. That might have been amusement. She moved closer, crouching down to bring herself to eye level with him. Those pointed ears tilted forward in a way that suggested active listening. "I am Empress Kalira of the Ashvaran Dominion," she said. "And you, Engineer Crane, have accomplished something remarkable." "I've accomplished being in tremendous pain," Ellis said. "Also possibly dying. The jury is still out on that one. You held this facility against 43 trained soldiers for nearly 6 hours using nothing but improvised weapons and what our tactical analysts are calling weaponized creativity. You caused 16 casualties without killing anyone, which suggests either remarkable restraint or remarkable luck." "Mostly I was just trying not to die," Ellis admitted. "The not killing anyone part was kind of a bonus. Your armor seems really well made, by the way. Took a lot of effort to even slow you down. I'd compliment the manufacturer, but I assume that's classified military technology." Kalira studied him for a long moment, and Ellis had the uncomfortable sensation of being evaluated in ways he couldn't quite understand. Her eyes, dark and ancient and far too perceptive, seemed to be looking past his injuries and exhaustion to something underneath. "Why didn't you evacuate with the others?" she asked. "Coolant recycler," Ellis said, making a face. "I was fixing it when everyone left. By the time I climbed out of the access tunnel, I'd been abandoned to my fate, which seemed rude at the time, though in retrospect was probably the correct tactical decision. And when you realized you were alone facing an invasion force, you decided to fight." "I decided not to die quietly," Ellis corrected. "There's a difference. Fighting implies I had a plan. What I had was a maintenance background and a deep-seated objection to being killed in my workplace. Health and safety nightmare, really. The paperwork alone would be unconscionable." That got a reaction, a slight curve of her lips that might have been a smile. She stood, and Ellis craned his neck to follow her movement, which sent fresh waves of pain through his various injuries. "The Ashvaran value courage above all else," Kalira said. "Individual prowess, the willingness to stand against impossible odds. These are the foundations of our culture. We have encountered dozens of species in our expansion, Engineer Crane. Most fled or surrendered when confronted with superior force. Your species has done both in most cases." "We're big fans of not dying," Ellis said. "It's very popular among humans, but not universal, apparently." Kalira gestured to the destroyed station around them. "You stood alone. You forced my soldiers to adapt tactics designed for conventional warfare. You turned your environment into a weapon. You demonstrated something we did not expect to find in humanity, an appalling disregard for equipment warranties, and an almost religious devotion to potential. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. I came to this world expecting to conquer or bypass another unremarkable species, Kalira continued. You've made that calculation more complex. Elas tried to process this through the fog of pain and exhaustion. An alien empress had personally come down to tell him he'd been inconvenient enough to warrant special attention. It would have been flattering if it weren't completely terrifying. So what happens now, he asked. You're not going to just let me limp away, and I'm fresh out of things to explode at you. Kalira extended her hand toward him, palm up in a gesture that transcended species barriers. Now you have a choice, Engineer Crane. You can refuse my offer and remain here while my forces continue their advance across your colonies. Your gesture, while impressive, changes nothing strategically. Or you can accept my hand, come aboard my ship, and help me understand why one human with a maintenance background was more trouble than an entire planetary garrison. Elas looked at the offered hand, then gazed past her to where the soldiers stood in their perfect formation. Through the broken walls of the station, he could see the sky beyond, gray, green, and unwelcoming as always. Somewhere up there, humanity's forces were regrouping, preparing for battles they'd probably lose. And here he was being offered something by the person leading the invasion. This is the worst job interview I've ever had, Elas said, but he reached up with his good arm and took her hand. Her grip was strong, and she pulled him to his feet with surprising ease. He swayed, vision swimming, and she steadied him with her other hand on his shoulder. Her presence was reassuring in a way that seemed fundamentally at odds with the situation. If I'm going to help you understand humans, Elas continued, you should probably know that we're all terrible at communication, prone to making poor decisions under stress, and we have a cultural tendency to joke about things that terrify us, like alien invasions, or death, or right now, specifically. I'm beginning to understand that, Kalira said, and this time the smile was unmistakable. She turned to her soldiers and issued commands in that musical language. Two of them moved forward, clearly intending to help support Elas as they began walking toward the station's landing pad, where presumably a shuttle waited. As they stepped out into Turius IX's perpetually overcast daylight, Elas felt the absurdity of his situation crystallize into something approaching comprehension. He'd accidentally made humanity interesting to a civilization that had dismissed them. He'd survived through stubbornness and improvisation. And now he was limping toward an alien spacecraft, bleeding on very expensive armor, about to become the galaxy's worst or possibly best first contact ambassador. For what it's worth, Elas said as the wind from a landing pad whipped around them, carrying the scent of ozone and possibility, I'm definitely going to need medical attention before any meaningful diplomatic discussions. And possibly a very strong drink. Do your people have alcohol? Please tell me you have alcohol. Kalira's laugh was surprisingly warm, echoing across the ruined facility and the battlefield beyond, where one stubborn human had held the line and somehow, impossibly, changed everything. Together, they walked toward whatever came next.